Good afternoon. We're going to look at abstract expressionism today. This term was first used in connection with some of Kandinsky's early paintings. It was in this particular movement, it was first used to describe Gorky and Pollock, their particular works. What the artists exhibited in this period was a spirit of revolt against tradition, and they believed very much in spontaneous expression. And the abstract expressionists are also known as the New York School. Who were the abstract expressionists? Gorky, Pollock, Willem de Kooning, Gottlieb, Rothko, Klein, Guston, Hoffman, Still, Newman, Motherwell, Toby, Mitchell, Frankenthaler, Elaine de Kooning, and Krasner. Now, this was an American style of the 1940s and 1950s, and the painting that you see here was done by Jackson Pollock. There were two methods of abstract expressionism: gesture and color field. The first, being gesture, the paintings were based on intense painterly gesture on the part of the artist. This is also called action painting, as seen in de Kooning and Jackson Pollock. This particular example you're looking at here is by Willem de Kooning, and as you look at a painting like this, you can't help but think about the violent physical nature of making the painting, and so that's why it's called a gesture painting. The other side of the coin is color field paintings, and these were paintings that featured large expanses of unmodulated color, as seen in Newman and Rothko. Now, Willem de Kooning was born Dutch, but he immigrated to the United States in 1926. He lived until 1997. An early influence on de Kooning was the painter Ingres. He was great friends with Arshile Gorky, and he usually kept figurative elements in his paintings. Now, his grotesque series of paintings of women shocked viewers and displeased the critics of the time, who favored pure abstraction or non-objective art. Calling this abstract expressionism, this movement, is a bit of a misnomer because most of the artists in the movement were indeed non-objective. Here's a photograph of de Kooning with his painting called Man from 1939, going way back. Let's get on quickly to some of color images by de Kooning. This is called Legend and Fact from 1940. The thing that you take out of this painting is it looks like he's very interested in contours and edges and does a lot of very careful, subtle blending throughout the painting. And this comes out of that French painter Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres. You may recall that he advised Degas, for instance, one of the Impressionists, to draw many lines. And this painting is essentially about that same idea, about the integrity of the line. This is a painting by de Kooning also from 1939 called Seated Man. And you see, while it's very energetic in terms of the paint application in different areas, really the emphasis of the painting still remains on the exterior contours, the shape that he's creating in the painting. This is Seated Woman from 1940, kind of a nice bookend to the Man that we just looked at. Great range of color in these paintings. It's beautiful the way the blue-greens contrast against the yellows and reds, the kind of warmer tones. It's almost like Picasso's Rose period meets his blue period in the same paintings. This is de Kooning's Queen of Hearts from 1943 to 1946. I think you probably are aware of the fact that he's shifting away from naturalism in his paintings. They're looking progressively more abstract as we go along. And that abstraction is only going to pick up speed here as we continue. This is simply called Painting from 1948. De Kooning went through a phase where he did exclusively black and white paintings, where he's very involved with investigating different shapes and different brush strokes and different methods of applying paint, but at this point is not concerned with painting a man or a woman, for instance. He's solely interested in making a painting and in creating sort of a meditation on the act of painting. One of his best known early paintings is this one called Asheville, where you see there's sort of the black and white basis for the painting, the structure, the foundation, if you will, but he's starting to add some color back in now. So some of the color from the previous painting almost seems like it's emerging. It's almost like he'd attacked a color painting with only the black and white and just let bits of it show through. A lot of energy, and that energy is going to continue to be a dominant force in de Kooning's work. Now this is the first of his series of paintings of women. This is called Woman 1 from 1950 to 1952. And you can understand, I think, why the critics and the general public were so shocked by what he was doing here. There's nothing beautiful about this woman. You know, the misshapen features, the horribly exaggerated eyes and breasts, the teeth that look like she might bite your head off literally. But these paintings, when you see one of these in a museum, are really moving to look at because you just can't help but admire the incredible energy that went into making the paintings. They're not quickly knocked off. It's layer upon layer of thick paint, and you really get into looking at just the whole idea of making a painting when you're looking at one of these. It almost, to me, becomes secondary that it's of a woman. This is Gotham News from 1955. You know, de Kooning back and forth for a while, went with the figure, eliminated the figure. Goes with the figure, eliminates the figure. And here we are again, eliminating the figure. I want to make clear that the woman that we looked at just now is just one of a series of many paintings that he did of women that really kind of established him as a major player in the American art scene. And this is Untitled painting from 1959. De Kooning, along with Jackson Pollock, lived out in the Hamptons on Long Island in New York. And to me, a lot of the abstractions immediately following the series of paintings of women are kind of reminiscent of landscapes. Simple color sort of thing going on. Keep in mind the scale of these paintings generally are quite large. The brush strokes that you see here are probably almost the product of a house painting brush as opposed to a fine artist sable brush or something like that. Now I want to show you this particular late piece by de Kooning, and you see a photograph of him on the right late in his life. He lived until 1997, but at the end of his life he was suffering from Alzheimer's, and a lot of people take issue with these paintings. Were they really the product of de Kooning? Were they the product of studio assistants who were looking to help make money in the de Kooning name? They're so different in terms of the whole idea of the paintings that I have trouble believing that they're exclusively by his hand. But then again, maybe it's just what happened to his mind, or maybe it was just a flowering of unique thought that took place late in his life. Now, Jackson Pollock is another American painter who lived until 1956. He was trained in the regionalist manner. His teacher, in fact, was Thomas Hart Benton, who we looked at as one of the regionalist painters in our Painting in the USA slideshow. He was influenced by the Mexican muralists. What some of the Mexican muralists were actually doing was using spray guns to apply paint, and Pollock saw that and thought this could be an entirely new way of making a painting. He came up with his abstract drip technique in 1947. He'd done some paintings that were sort of in the manner of Picasso, but he ultimately grew very dissatisfied with that because he felt like Picasso had done everything. And since Picasso had sort of captured every look, the only way to come up with a new method of painting, a new style of painting, was to come up with an entirely new way of making the painting. He employs an all-over style, and by that I mean it looks like this painting expands well beyond the borders. It's just, there's not a foreground, a background. It's just an expansive stretch of canvas that's been covered with marks. Late in Pollock's career, he returned to the figure, and you might see a drip painting like this, but a head that would be recognizable in it. And what's funny about that is that the critics gave him a really hard time at the start, finally got used to it, and then when he returned to the figure, they gave him a hard time for that. You know, it was a you can't win for losing sort of situation for Jackson Pollock. Here's a photograph of Pollock on the left. You may get a sense here of the tortured artist effect, and I think that sort of is the case with Pollock. On the right is a painting by Thomas Hart Benton called The Twist, and you can see that his paintings look nothing like that of his teacher, although early on there were some similarities. Pollock said it was important for him to have studied with Benton because it really gave him something to push off of, to rebel against. Pollock the painter, Pollock the painting student, is like the rebellious teenager. This is called Gothic from 1944. A lot of great color, a lot of great marks. Not entirely different from what we saw with some of de Kooning's black and white paintings, some stuff from that period. Trying to find his way at this point. And he really doesn't find his way until he gets to that drip painting. Now this is an important painting by Pollock in the center here. It was a mural for Peggy Guggenheim that he made in 1943, and he had this commission and he had this important painting that he had to do, and it was something that he struggled with, and he couldn't decide what to do. And finally, in just an incredible fury, he executed almost the entire painting the night before it was due to be delivered. This is number 1 from 1950, a painting called Lavender Mist. And you really see the full exploration of his all-over drip style. This one is Autumn Rhythm, number 30, also from 1950. Pollock had some encounter with Hans Hofmann, who was a noted teacher of this period and who taught a number of abstract expressionists, at least the second generation abstract expressionists, most notably Lee Krasner, who was Pollock's wife. And Hofmann came around Pollock's studio and made some complimentary statements, and then ultimately he came to say, this is no good, because you don't work from nature, you'll repeat yourself. And Pollock had, I think, one of the great responses in all of art history. He said, I am nature. And this is Blue Poles from 1952. What Pollock would do, working method, is he would paint on the floor. He would roll out the canvas on the floor of his studio, and he would just drip and pour and fling the paint. Some people said that, if it looked good, it was a result of an accident, but Pollock clearly demonstrated that he could control the flow of the paint. There's a film of him that shows him painting on glass, and it's filmed from below, and you can tell he definitely knows where he's going here. But what he would do, he'd work on the floor, and then he would look at the painting and look at where everything had ended and decide, okay, it's going to begin here, it's going to end here. And he would cut the canvas down to size at that point. And that also contributes to the painting looking like it expands well beyond the borders. Now, Arshile Gorky is probably my favorite painter from this period. He was born in Turkish Armenia, lives until 1948. He immigrated to the United States in 1920. He was influenced by Cezanne, Picasso, and Stuart Davis, among many other artists. He had a very unique style of abstraction, and some people have called Arshile Gorky the last surrealist and the first abstract expressionist. This is an early landscape by Arshile Gorky from 1927 to 1928, and I would hope that you'd immediately say, wow, that looks like a Cézanne, a late Cézanne, like maybe one of the Mount Saint Victoire paintings. Gorky really studied Cézanne and took him as his master for a good little period of time and did some fantastic paintings in Cézanne's manner. Here are a couple more paintings that are done kind of in Cézanne's manner. The one on the left is his self-portrait at the age of 9, painted in 1928. The one on the right is a still life of flowers, also from 1928. Getting a little looser, and you see he's starting to kind of let the brushstrokes go compared to the relative control that we saw in the landscape and the portrait. But both continued explorations of Cézanne's ideas in painting. This one is called Organization from 1936, and this is a painting that's done very much in the manner of some of Picasso's synthetic cubist paintings and later expressive period paintings. People were laughing, saying there's this crazy Armenian guy in New York who's making perfect little Picassos. What Gorky basically did is he painted his way through art history, and after he'd learned everything he could from each artist, he moved on to another artist, and when he'd finished, he then kind of took the best of everybody and then plugged his soul into it, so to speak, and started making some really great, unique abstractions that were wholly his. This on the left is a photograph of Gorky as a child and his mother, and you see the beautiful drawing that he made on the right of the artist and his mother. This series that he worked on, he did 2 paintings from this, took place from the mid-20s till about 1936. And here is one of the paintings, Artist and His Mother, that was done from 1926 to 1936. Now, one thing that I maintain is that if you look at the drawing, if you look at the faces in particular in this painting, exquisitely done, can draw as beautifully as he would like to, as realistically as he would like to. If somebody can do it anyway and chooses to work in an abstract fashion, I think the burden then of trying to understand the painting is more on the viewer as opposed to the artist needing to explain himself. He's demonstrated quite clearly that he can handle any technique, so why is it that he chooses to work in that way? What's he trying to say? That's up to the viewer to engage the painting and come up with some answers to those questions. This is called The Liver is the Coxcomb from 1944. Gorky's titles are really kind of crazy in some cases, and in some cases they're things that you just can't really tie into the painting. He'd let friends come by the studio and say, what do you think I ought to title this? And they would just toss something out there, and whether that had anything to do with what he was trying to do or not, he would use it in some cases. So they're a little difficult to read at times. This is called Agony from 1947. If you look at the colors and the shapes and the forms, I think you definitely get some feeling for that emotion. At the end of Gorky's life, he went through many, many horrible situations. His wife left him, took the kids, broke his neck, wasn't able to paint, had rectal cancer, had to have a colostomy. Just horrible things, one after another, and finally Gorky, his studio burns down and destroyed a lot of his work, and at that point Gorky committed suicide. It's a sad end to a great painter's life, but you look at a painting like this, and when you know the story, and then you see the title, and then you see the painting, wow, it becomes a very powerful abstraction that speaks directly to you. Mark Rothko was born in Russia and lived until 1970, worked primarily in the United States. He's one of the creators of color field painting. He was self-taught as an artist, and he's known for these large vertical format paintings. His late work was very dark in color, that's symbolic of the depression that led to his suicide, and the Rothko Chapel in Houston is his masterpiece. On the left here we have a painting called Green and Maroon from 1953. And on the right, I'll bet you can guess, it's Orange and Yellow from 1956. These paintings are just sort of meditations on how one color affects the way you see another color. And these are large paintings. You stand in front of them in the museum and you just get a feel for this beautiful atmosphere and these beautiful colors that Rothko has created in his work. Now, this is the Rothko Chapel in Houston, Texas, and you see these large, almost seemingly black panels. And what's really cool about this place is you walk in and it's like an octagonally shaped room, and you're surrounded by these black panels. The light's very dim in there, especially after you come out of the hot Texas sun. And you first think that these paintings are only black. And then as your eyes adjust, you start seeing blues, greens, reds, purples, almost every color. And all these paintings start to speak to you. And this is one of the most spiritually cool places I've ever been. You know, there's generally a number of people inside, but everybody's really into themselves, and it's a great meditative place. Everybody's so quiet when you're in this room that the hum of the air conditioners becomes almost deafening. It's a really great place to go. Philip Guston, another American who lived until 1980. He was friends with Jackson Pollock when they were in high school. He was a muralist for the Federal Art Project from 1935 to 1942. Around 1950, he eliminated the figure and nature from his work. He's actually been called an abstract impressionist because of his marks and his colors. And in the 1970s, he reintroduced the figure into his paintings and really blew a lot of people's minds with the style of his work then. Guston's work really goes through about 3 distinct phases. On the left here, we have a painting called Bombardment from 1937 to 1938. On the right is The Gladiators from 1940. And so the early work is figurative. Almost the Gladiators really reminds me a lot of a Max Beckmann painting, one of the Expressionists that we looked at. A little bit coming out of the social realist phase. You know, he seems to be making a comment in Bombardment on war. Is that a skull or is it a gas mask that you see to the right of that painting? This is called Zone from 1953 to 1954, and this is a typical look for a Guston painting. This square canvas with just the kind of almost noodling marks where the color builds up heavier in the center and it kind of dissipates as you move toward the edges. Guston was very fond of this playing off roses, reds, pinks, these sorts of colors with a little hint of green here or there. And this is what he became known for and was very celebrated for a considerable period of time until the last phase of his career. And this is an example of the last phase of Guston's career, a painting called Painting, Smoking, Eating, 1973. And Guston was very influenced by like the Crazy Cat cartoons of the 30s and things like that, the old comic strips, and he brought that to life in his late paintings that are just zany and crazy and so different from what we just looked at. Yet you might notice here that what is he doing? He's still working with the same range of color. He just felt the need to reintroduce the figure at this point. It's a great thing to have that kind of freedom as an artist, that you can reinvent yourself every day if you want. Clifford Still was an American who lived until 1980. He was a pioneer of very large monochromatic paintings. Worked in an impasto manner. That means he applied very thick paint. The jagged edges that you see here in his work were his trademark. And he worked in isolation to fuel his artistic inspiration. He didn't really hang out with a lot of other people or try to get their ideas and let that influence his paintings. Now this is an early work by Clifford Still from 1937. that I just wanted to show because I want to show, like Gorky, a lot of these artists came from a naturalistic tradition, here making a painting that's not terribly unlike Millet's. And this is from called 1957 D, number 1. And this is typical of what you see in a Clifford still painting. Those great jagged edges and the dramatic contrasts of light and dark. This painting happens to have the yellow in there, but it almost, you would think, be as effective if it were just black and white. Barnett Newman was an American who lived until 1970. He was a member of the New York School, and he was also a writer on art. Now, his work was generally simpler than the other abstract expressionists, and he called the stripes that were usually vertical in his paintings his zips. But Newman, like Rothko, is kind of a influence on minimalism, and also he's thought to be one of the color field painters. And this is Newman's painting called Who's Afraid of Red, Yellow, and Blue, number 3, from 1966 to 1967. When you see one of these Newman paintings in the museum, they look very simple, but if they have those stripes in them, like in the previous image, you stare at it long enough, your eyes start playing tricks on you, and those stripes appear to start moving and vibrating and going back and forth. And they can provide for a really cool experience if you'll give it a chance and take a couple minutes to look at it. This is Newman's Broken Obelisk, the sculpture here, from 1963 to 1967. Kind of great the way it comes to that point and teeters there, and yet it's as sturdy as can be, and you get a really great sense for the scale of this sculpture as well. Hans Hofmann, born in Germany, lived until 1966, bad year for artists, became a U.S. citizen in 1941, and he founded his own schools and taught in both Munich and New York. And he closed his school in 1958 so that he could concentrate on his own painting. So he had 8 years, I guess, at the end of his life that he worked exclusively on his work as opposed to trying to push others along the way. And a lot of people think that Hoffman was the first to come up with the drip technique, but he didn't use it exclusively, and that distinction belongs to Jackson Pollock. On the left is Hoffman's painting called The Gate from 1959 to 1960. On the right is a painting called Equinox from 1958. The principle that Hoffman espoused in his work was called push-pull. And you look how different colored areas, different rectangles of color in these paintings appear to come forward or recede. And it's interesting that based on the colors that he surrounds a color with, different ones push forward or pull back. In the painting on the left, that yellow really comes forward, where the red fades back, the blue is just completely gone. You look at the painting on the right, and those beautiful blue rectangles, because they're surrounded by warm colors, really push forward, while the yellows and reds pull back. So push-pull, he's making space, but he's not referring, for instance, to a landscape. Franz Kline was an American who lived until 1962. He began by painting urban landscapes, and he was influenced by de Kooning, remember his black and white paintings from earlier in the slideshow, and by Oriental calligraphy. He saw some of his drawings enlarged by a projector, and that made him realize that they could be powerful abstractions. And this is Franz Kline's painting called Bethlehem. And I've had students write about this in the past and go into how it must be a meditation on religion or something like that. What's funny about that is the fact that Franz Kline is from Pennsylvania, and Bethlehem is the name of a city in Pennsylvania. Adolf Gottlieb was an American who lived until 1974. His early work featured expressionist and surrealist landscapes. The shapes in his paintings stand for Freudian symbols or abstract mythological concepts, and he believed that he could reinvent age-old mankind's symbols. Robert Motherwell, another American painter, lived until 1991. He did paintings, he did collages, he also wrote on art. He studied aesthetics at Stanford and Harvard. Now, his work's different from a lot of the other members of the abstract expressionists because it was abstract from the beginning. And from 1958 to 1971, he was married to Helen Frankenthaler, who's another one of the abstract expressionists. Mark Tobey was an American who lived until 1976. His work was inspired by Oriental art, thought, and religion, and he's best known for his white writing paintings like you see here. His all-over manner prefigured Jackson Pollock, so Pollock wasn't the first to do a lot of these things, but he was the one to really get the attention for his work. Mark Tobey is highly regarded in Europe, a little less so by comparison in the United States. Now, there were a number of women that did significant work in the abstract expressionist movement, both in the first and second generation. They include Lee Krasner, Elaine de Kooning, Joan Mitchell, and Helen Frankenthaler. Joan Mitchell was an American who lived until 1992. She was the daughter of a poet, and she was influenced by Van Gogh, Cezanne, and Gorky. She transformed memories of landscapes into abstractions, like you see here, and she often left the white of the canvas untouched in her paintings. They're almost like large, thick watercolors, but done in oil on canvas as opposed to watercolor on paper. Helen Frankenthaler was an American born in 1928. She was influenced by Gorky and Pollock, and her typical working method was that of applying thin paint to unprimed canvas. They're very suggestive of landscapes, and she was married to Robert Motherwell. Elaine de Kooning was an American who lived until 1989. She was a painter and an art critic, married to Willem de Kooning. She's known for her expressive portraiture, and unlike her husband's series of paintings of women, Elaine concentrated on painting men, and this is a portrait of the painter Fairfield Porter. Fairfield Porter did beautiful landscape paintings, and his brother Elliot Porter was a noted photographer. And Lee Krasner is our last artist that we'll look at today. She lives until 1984. She was the wife of Jackson Pollock. She worked for the Federal Art Project, studied under Hans Hofmann. Early on, she worked in a cubist manner, and themes of plant forms and birth and death recur throughout her work. Hope you've enjoyed this look at abstract expressionism.